In the early 1980s, two brothers were found brutally murdered in their Houston, Texas home. There was no forced entry, no defensive wounds, and no clear motive. Yet both men, Ronald and Kenneth Elliott, had been savagely mutilated, left in what investigators described as one of the most gruesome crime scenes in Texas history. Over 4 decades later, the case remains unsolved. No arrests, no public suspects, and no clear reason why someone would want to destroy the lives of two quiet, seemingly ordinary men. This is the story of the Elliott brothers' mutilation murders, and why, despite everything, it still makes no sense. Ronald and Kenneth Elliott lived in a modest one-story home in northeast Houston. Ronald was in his early 30s and worked a steady job in the shipping industry. Kenneth, a few years younger, held various short-term positions but struggled with health issues and was sometimes described as reclusive. By all accounts, the brothers were close. Neither was married. Neither had children. They mostly kept to themselves, their lives revolving around work, quiet routines, and each other. They didn't have enemies. They weren't involved in drugs, crime, or known disputes. They were the kind of people who left no real footprint outside their own circle, which is what made what happened next even more disturbing. It was the afternoon of October 1st, 1982, when a concerned relative arrived at the modest brick home on East 43rd Street in Houston, Texas. Phone calls had gone unanswered for over a day, unusual for Ronald and Kenneth Elliott, who kept regular routines and close ties with their family. When the door was finally opened, either with a spare key or by authorities, the scene inside was like something out of a horror film. The living room was splashed with blood. Furniture was overturned, suggesting some sort of struggle, but it wasn't chaotic. It was selectively disturbed, almost as if the violence had been contained. Then came the bodies. Both Ronald and Kenneth Elliott were found bound and gagged, their limbs tied behind their backs with what appeared to be strips of cloth or electrical cord. They had been stabbed multiple times, with deep, focused wounds that didn't appear frenzied, but deliberate. Even more disturbing, there were signs of post-mortem mutilation. Parts of their bodies had been cut, arranged, or altered in ways that investigators would later describe as symbolic or possibly ritualistic. Details of the mutilation were never released to the public in full, possibly to protect the integrity of the case, but sources suggest it was targeted and precise, not random or sloppy. Despite the brutality, there were no signs of forced entry. The front door was locked. All windows were intact. Nothing was broken or smashed open. This meant that whoever committed the murders had likely been let in voluntarily, perhaps even invited. And although parts of the house were blood-stained and disrupted, nothing appeared to be stolen. Cash, watches, and electronics were untouched. There were no open drawers, no missing valuables. This was not a robbery. This was intentional violence, carried out by someone who came there to kill, and nothing more. Even more disturbing, nothing was stolen. Valuables, cash, and electronics were untouched. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was something else, something much darker. From the start, the case confounded detectives. No witnesses, no forced entry, no theft, and no obvious motive. Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood, speaking with neighbors and coworkers. The Elliott brothers were described as quiet, polite, and introverted. They didn't host parties. They weren't involved in drugs. And no one reported hearing any screaming, gunshots, or loud disturbances on the night of the murders. It was as if the crime had happened in total silence. Ronald, the older brother, held a stable job and kept to a routine. Kenneth was less socially active due to health problems but had no enemies. Neither had a criminal record. There were no known romantic relationships or jealous exes, and no signs that either man was involved in anything risky or illegal. Yet the extreme level of violence, especially the mutilation, suggested that the murders were deeply personal. Investigators theorized that whoever killed them knew them, or at least had been watching them closely. One detective at the time remarked that it felt like the killer was sending a message, only no one knows what that message was. They explored every lead they could. Workplace disputes? None. Financial stress? No debts? No life insurance red flags? Jealousy or revenge? no known incidents or threats. The case stalled almost immediately, and without witnesses or a confession, they had no one to charge. In 1982, forensic science was still primitive compared to today. Investigators could collect fingerprints, blood samples, and trace evidence, but DNA testing as we know it wasn't available. At the crime scene, they reportedly gathered multiple fingerprints and hair samples, but without a national DNA database or forensic profile systems, there was no way to connect them to a suspect unless they already had one in custody. Even worse, the crime scene was complicated. There were multiple prints, some possibly from guests or friends. No one stood out. The physical evidence, the bindings, the murder weapon, which was never recovered, blood spatters, and partial fingerprints, was carefully preserved. But without modern forensic tools, they couldn't extract the kind of insight they could today. Over time, the leads went cold. Tips stopped coming in. News coverage faded. The case file was quietly moved to cold storage, waiting for either a miracle or a mistake from the killer. Over the years, several theories emerged, most of them speculative. Some locals believed the murders were the work of a serial killer. They pointed to similarities with other unsolved homicides in the area around the same time. Young men found murdered, mutilated, and left in staged positions. But no official link was ever established. Others suggested the brothers had stumbled into something they weren't supposed to see, a drug operation or illicit deal that led to their deaths. But again, no evidence supported this. There were even rumors of a satanic ritual angle, fueled by the nature of the mutilation and the era's growing panic about occult crimes. But investigators have never confirmed this theory, and it's generally viewed as speculative folklore rather than fact. What remained was a haunting truth. 2 men, brutally killed, for reasons still unknown. As of now, the Elliott brothers' case remains officially unsolved. The Houston Police Department maintains a file on the case, and the evidence has reportedly been reviewed periodically over the years. There were attempts to reprocess items for DNA as testing improved, but no public breakthroughs have been announced. Family members have long since stopped talking to the media, and few who were close to Ronald or Kenneth are still around to push for answers. What's left is a file, a crime scene, and a set of questions that no one has ever been able to answer. What happened to Ronald and Kenneth Elliott was not just violent, it was personal. Whoever killed them went far beyond what was necessary to take a life. This was a display of anger, control, or something even more disturbing. And yet, there is no suspect, no motive, no justice. The Elliott brothers lived quietly and died violently, and today, their story is almost forgotten, buried under decades of newer tragedies. But the case still matters, because someone, somewhere, knows the truth. And until that truth surfaces, this cold case remains one of the most brutal and baffling murders in Texas history. If you believe this case deserves answers, share this story. Someone may remember something. Subscribe to Unlocked Confidential for more forgotten cases, buried truths, and mysteries that still demand justice.